Hey everybody, welcome back to the shop. So I'm going to start making something today that I have been wanting for over 20 years. If you haven't figured it out already from all of the hints I've been dropping over the last couple of weeks, I'm making a mill. What I really want to be able to do is to take trees off of my tree line and other locations around my area and be able to mill them into boards. That way I'm not limited by what I can find in the stores. And of course, don't get me started on the wood prices these days. I think you all know what's going on there. But when you really start looking at milling down your own material, you'll realize it only costs about 1/3 of what you pay for in the store. The first thing I needed to build was the wheels, and so what I needed to do was to set up the bandsaw blade that I'd already bought, and I could measure that to get the rough dimensions of the wheels that I wanted to build and the size of the head. The diameter of wheel I ended up with was a 20-inch. You really don't need to go much beyond that because the reason you would make a bigger bandsaw wheel for the bigger blades is so that you don't reduce its lifespan. And 20-inch really is the point of diminishing return where you can pretty much put any size bandsaw wheel on here and it'll run just fine. Since I'm making 2 bandsaw wheels, I decided to cut 4 circles at 21.5-inch diameter out of this 3/8-inch plywood. That way I would have plenty of material to lathe down later. One of the biggest considerations for me when designing this mill was the cost. People will often tell you that the cheapest way of milling logs into lumber is to use something like a chainsaw mill, but that just starting out, just to get the chainsaw itself would cost you somewhere around $500 minimum just to get started, and that doesn't even include the cost of all of the milling attachments. And so the reason I decided to jump on this bandsaw mill concept was because when I was doing the math, I realized all I really need is a couple of pieces of threaded rod, some shafting, and some bearings, and the rest of it really just need to be made out of wood. Oh, and the motor. Whatever motor you choose should probably be calculated in the price. But when it all really came down to it, I figured out I could use this method, and I could probably do this for under $200 minus the cost of whatever motor or engine I ended up deciding on. And so that's why, for the first time ever, this project is actually attainable for me. Now, I really don't want to make it sound like I'm intentionally copying anyone, but when I was doing a bunch of research trying to figure out what design to use, a couple of my different parts I took a ton of inspiration from the Matthias Wandel channel. And these wheels are a perfect example of that because they're very similar to his design. Basically all it is you make a segmented ring around the outside of the wheel, and then you put a bunch of spokes in the center that lead to a solid piece in the middle that holds the axle. I decided to design this entire wheel just around an octagon because it's so much easier to line something like that up than a larger segmented piece. And so because the outside ring is an octagon, the inside needed an octagon as well, and that's what I'm cutting here. I needed a hole for the shaft to fit through, and I actually cut this about 1/8 of an inch wider than I actually needed it so that I could have some room to play with it later. The shafting doesn't actually ride on the sides of this hole, it just rides through it. And then last I can make all of the spokes. When cutting down the spokes, I cut both spokes that oppose each other at the exact same time so I could make sure this hole ended up exactly in the center. And then everything can just be glued up. Now, I did use a ton of extra material because I was a little worried this wasn't going to be robust enough once I got all of that pressure from the mill on it. However, most of the material on this outside rig did end up getting turned off. I probably did make all these parts just a little bit thicker than they needed to be, but at least I know that it won't come apart when it's running. There's a lot of forces involved in a mill. Before I could put that second piece of plywood on the other side of the wheel, I had to transfer all of the holes through. And of course this includes the shaft hole, but it also includes the holes that is needed for the bolts for the bearing flanges. One of the things that Matthias talks about his wheels is that bearing flanges are a bad idea because they have a tendency to move on you when the wheel is running, and that is absolutely true, so I had to find a way of engineering around it. The reason I decided to do that rather than to work with bearings inside of hardwood the way he does was I really couldn't guarantee that I could get the bearings to stay put, and that's one of the things I was worrying about with this. And to tell you the truth, the bearing flanges over on Amazon were cheaper with the bearing flanges than without. So I'm going to be putting a link in the description to these bearing flanges, but if I wanted to use these bearings, I would have bought them with the flanges anyway and then just removed them. But once I had them, I decided I might as well just use them. I'm finding it more and more difficult over time to buy things locally. I went to Menards to try and buy some bearings that I know that they used to sell maybe a decade ago, but they didn't seem to have anything like that. And when I asked one of the workers if they had any bearings in stock, he didn't know what I was talking about, and so I just kept saying bearings, like ball bearings. And he says, well, I'm not really sure what that is, what are they? And so I told him, you know, like on the inside of a skateboard wheel, there's bearings. I want ones that fit a 1-inch shaft. And you know what he told me? He said, I don't think those will fit a 1-inch shaft. And I said, I know, I need ones that do fit a 1-inch shaft. He didn't know bearings came in multiple sizes. And maybe it's just stores like Menards, but there's really no expertise at a lot of the local stores anymore, and so it's so much easier just to figure out what I want by myself, and then just to go to a place like Amazon and buy it online. So the next step was to cut the wheels down into circles, and the majority of this is just so that I can get it down to something that's round that I can lathe later, but I also set the blade to a 2-degree angle because I wanted to see if that was a good way to cut the crown into the wheel. I really didn't end up liking how this looked when it was done, and I couldn't really get a consistent crown, believe it or not, with this. Even though I had it jigged up so that it wouldn't move, the crown didn't end up in the center of the wheel, and I'm not really sure why that is, but either way, I ended up lathing down a bunch of this material anyway. I probably don't need to say this, but this is actually a really dangerous method if you ever want to try it. It's a lot of fun, and it works very well, but you really have to keep an eye on where your hands are. Another thing I took from the Matthias hollow bandsaw wheels was the use of these inner tubes. These work fantastic to add a little bit of extra grip onto your bandsaw blade. However, if you look closely, you'll see that I'm using 20-inch inner tubes for a 20-inch wheel, and that is a terrible idea. For a 20-inch wheel, a 16-inch inner tube works so much better. On the inside of these inner tubes, there's a little bit of this white powder. I'm not really sure what that's supposed to do, but you have to get that off before you can put it on the wheel. And you can completely ignore what I'm doing here with the bucket because I ended up just turning these inside out and throwing them in my washing machine, and that works so much better for getting this stuff off of there. So I figured out the blade speed that I needed once this 20-inch bandsaw wheel was up and spinning, and I figured out the pulley ratio based on that, and I based that second pulley that I needed to make off of a 2-inch pulley, and that ended up being about a 4.5-inch pulley that needed to be driven by a 2-inch pulley. And I've made a bunch of these pulleys in the past, and there's so many different ways of doing it, and what I decided to do here was just to cut 3 circles, one smaller than the other 2, so I could get the diameter of pulley that I needed. And this really did work very well once I figured out what the thickness of that inside piece was. I actually ended up switching that out here in a second. I started wondering whether or not this was really the best idea to cut the pulley this way. I did end up going with this, and it actually worked very well, but this is another one of those things that proceed at your own discretion. This is not the safest thing in the world, but it worked very well. And this is where I figured out that there was absolutely no way that the bearing flange that I had was going to fit on the same wheel as this pulley. So I got kind of frustrated and I just threw the pulley away thinking I was going to have to rebuild it. But then I realized if I take that pulley and I put it on the shaft of the motor and then just upscaled the pulley on the wheel, I could make the whole thing work. So I dug the pulley back out of the trash, and basically all I'm going to do is upscale both pulleys by a factor of 3, which gives me the exact same pulley ratio. This guy is such a dork. And so what that meant was that I had to make a second pulley that was much larger than the first to keep the same pulley ratio, and that ended up being about 11.5 inches. Since I didn't want to waste any more plywood than I already had making these pulleys, I decided to only use 2 sheets for this one. I also decided to make this pulley a little bit different to save on material. A pulley really doesn't need a flat piece in the middle of the pulley. Really all you need is a bevel on 2 different pieces of wood, and the belt is going to ride on that, because you never actually touch the center of the pulley with the belt anyway if the pulley is constructed properly. So as long as you have a firm connection between your 2 pieces, you only need 2 pieces of plywood. Because these bearing flanges are only bolted on, like I said earlier, they're going to have a tendency to want to move around under pressure. And so to accommodate that, the square piece that I cut out to have the flange recess into this pulley, I cut really tightly so that it wouldn't have a chance to move anywhere. And then I cut the same recess into 4 other pieces of scrap plywood to act as a retention for the other 3 flanges. With these ones, I decided to set my table to a slight angle so that I didn't have to be quite as accurate with the scroll saw. And that worked out very well. And now I can finally bolt these bearing flanges on, and those just bolt through the holes I drilled earlier. At this point, it was really easy to get everything aligned. And then I can put the wheel on, and this is the point where I need to start balancing the wheel. As soon as I put it on, I could tell how wobbly it was, but the cool thing about these flanges is they're just bolted on, and there's a little bit of extra space between the shaft and the inside of the hole that the shaft fits through, so all I have to do is keep tapping the wheel over and over again until it runs perfectly true. Eventually I did figure out that instead of tapping the wheel, it's a lot better to tap the flange over so that the wheel will run true, and this works so much better. Now here I realized that if I tried to get the wheel off the shaft, I was going to mess up all of the truing that I had just done, so I decided just to go ahead and cut the shaft in two so I could start setting up the other wheel. Oh jeez, I forgot I did that. Scary. And then I needed to clean up that cut because I didn't want to catch my shirt on it later. Now it's finally time to start lathing these down, which means I have to put a pulley on both of the wheels, but I only made one pulley and I don't want to make a second one, and so I put a flange on two of the wheels, and then I put a pulley on the non-pulley wheel, if that makes sense. This way I can lathe this one down first, and then take the pulley off, replace it with a flange, and then put the pulley back on the other wheel. At this point I decided to go ahead and permanently affix these two flanges on the outside of both wheels, and those just get screwed and glued into place. Now this part was a ton of fun. I put the shaft through a couple pieces of blocking and then clamped that to the workbench, and then I stuck a motor underneath the workbench and was actually able to lathe these down on the side of my workbench. I would put these on my lathe if I had one this large, but my lathe doesn't go anywhere near this large, so I had to get a little bit creative here. Alright, so this is a little bit off balance, so I want to run this as slow as possible. I have this pulley on the back set up for the 5,500 RPM motor. The one I have attached to it right now is only 3,500 RPM, so that's already slower, and I'm running a 2-inch pulley, and since I'm going from 2 to almost 12, that's like a 6x reduction from the speed of the 3,500 RPM motor. So I'm not sure what RPM that gives me. What is that, 3,500 divided by 6, I guess? That's how fast this is going to be spinning. Hopefully that's slow enough to get this thing concentric. I promise this isn't going to be quite as bad as the disc sander. Okay. Well, my motor spun, so let's fix that real quick. It's very important to remember to shave a very shallow crown into these wheels. This was so much fun. I kind of want to try it again. I am so happy with the way this is going. Now it's time to take the pulley off of this wheel and permanently affix it to the other wheel by gluing and screwing it into place, as well as this flange on that first wheel. This second wheel definitely gave me a bit more trouble than the first. Alright, so the other one balanced itself very well. I was able to lathe it down and get it concentric, and it's basically even weight. I probably won't have to do much to that one. But this one, you can see, has a very heavy spot, and I can't even lathe it concentric because of how much it bounces as I lathe it. I have it as lathed down as I can get it, and it's still not balanced enough to be able to do that, and that's just because of my setup here. So what I'm going to have to do is at least start to balance it, and because that's my low point there, I found that this much weight is enough to balance it. These three circles that I cut were the exact same weight as the square pieces that were balancing the wheel, and this is just a preliminary balancing. I'm going to do a more proper balancing later. This is just so that I can finish the lathing process without it bouncing off my workbench. Ow! Ow! I got it. Unfortunately, even though I marked exactly where I thought I was supposed to drill, I still ended up hitting one of my posts, so I had to cut this piece a little bit funny so that it would fit into place. And then I could just throw some pin nails in the back and fill the whole thing full of glue so everything would stay nice and rigid. And then I could cap the whole piece by gluing that piece into place as well, and then sanding over the entire surface to make it look nice and clean again. And now that the wheel is balanced enough, I can lathe this down, and this works so much better. And now it's finally time to put the inner tubes on the tire. I was so excited at this step because it basically meant that the wheels were done. However, I didn't realize that 20-inch inner tubes are no good on 20-inch bandsaw wheels. You really want something like a 16-inch. The 20-inch are just going to fly right off. So keep that in mind if you're ever going to build one. It occurs to me that I didn't actually do the final balancing of the wheel until I built the head of the mill, so that's going to happen in the next video. cool. We're somewhere around 89 inches. Beautiful. Hey, thank you all for watching. Let me know in the comments what you think of this project so far, and if you want to see the rest of the videos in this build series so far, I'm going to be putting a playlist at the end of this video, as well as all the other videos in the playlist so that you can watch the whole process. In the next video, I'm going to be making the blocking that holds the shaft and the head that's going to hold that blocking. So all of that mechanism so that I can get this blade up and off of the bench and hopefully onto the head of the mill. That's going to be next video. So you definitely don't want to miss that. Well, anyway, thank y'all for watching. Catch y'all next time. Go make something!